Yeah, hi, I'm Bill Grace, the branch manager here at the Tyrrell Historical Library. I want to welcome Professor Ted Campbell. He's going to have a very interesting talk today. He is was well, he's a native Beaumonter. He also is a professor at the Southern Methodist University, and he has done extensive writing on history, of course, as well as this particular tribe, the Attakapas tribe.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah.
So I want to welcome him and let him begin his talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. And I'm delighted to be here and to have this this group. We didn't anticipate quite so many, so we had not made enough sheets of information, but there are some information sheets going around and they're being recopied right now, so that should be there for you. Bill, I'm very grateful for the invitation and to the library staff and others. It's wonderful to be here. I grew up on Gilbert Street in Beaumont, and I remember coming to this building as a child when it was the Central Library here in Beaumont with my dad. Interestingly, he often brought the boys, myself and my brothers, to the library, and it was kind of inspiring to see. There was something that in ancient history was called a card catalog, and the card catalog was right up in the front of where the ministers would have sat at church, and the card catalog was completely occupied that evening, as I recall, by Lamar students who were here in the library doing their research. So I had a little taste, even from my elementary school days, of the kind of the excitement accompanying research, and this is an extension of that, but I'm very grateful to be here. In the very hot summer of 1980, my wife and I were fresh back from 2 years living in England, and we wanted to prove that we were true Texans. So we went tubing on the Guadalupe River for about 3 hours in exactly the middle of the day, and we had forgotten our sunblock. We showed up the next day with red roasted bodies to visit the Institute of Texas Cultures in San Antonio. I stood mesmerized in front of the first display I saw, a map that showed locations of historic native peoples in Texas. And where I grew up here in Beaumont, it did not show the Karankawa people that I expected to see, what we were taught in the 4th and 7th grade, but it showed Attakapaw people, and I presume to pronounce that like Atacapa. So, which sounds like a fraternity at SMU. A Louisiana friend just a couple of weeks later laughed at me when I said that, and he set me straight. He said, maybe it's more like Attakapaw, and even the sound of that word sounded very authentic to me. A couple of years later, maybe I better turn this on. Judith Walker Lindsley and Ellen Walker Rinstra came out with their book on Beaumont, A Chronicle of Progress. And that was what my wife bought me for Christmas that year. It was the first book I'd ever seen that specifically named the Attakapaw as the native people of Southeast Texas. By then, I was more than intrigued. I was absolutely hooked. And I was especially fascinated with one name that appeared in all of the accounts of surviving speakers of the Attakapaw language. Her name was Delphine Williams, and I quote, wife of J.R. Williams, Beaumont, Texas. Delphine and J.R. and their 6 or 8 kids were shown as living in the 1910 census of Beaumont at 371 North Cypress Street, which is, as you can see, here we are, Google Maps, very close by, 2 minutes, 0.4 miles. And there she's living in a boarding house with all of her brood of kids and so forth. And she sounded like a relative to me because some of my relatives are here and they know that my mother had a sister named Delphine and my paternal grandmother was named Williams. That was her maiden name. So it sounded like a family member, but it wasn't, as it turns out. I don't think I'm related to her in any way. But if one person living, this is what I began thinking, if one person was living on Cypress Street in Beaumont in 1907 to 1910, and she spoke the native language of this area, it was clear to me, especially because they had scads of kids, all who showed up with their own kids, her grandkids, at her funeral in Port Arthur in 1930, there simply must be descendants among the people of Southeast Texas. I actually wrote letters to random people in the Beaumont telephone book. Now, there used to be big fat books that listed the names of everybody in a town or a city, and I found people with the names like Reon, R-E-O-N, that were the names of some of these 10 speakers of the Attakapaw language, and I wrote to them and said, maybe you're a descendant. Do you have any idea about that? Nobody wrote back, got no responses whatsoever. But as I learned more about Delphine Williams' story, a wider story of Attakapaw descendants began to open up. I had a strong sense from that time that there simply must be descendants of Native people remaining in Southeast Texas. If some of you are from Port Arthur, a version of Delphine's story was published that I wrote in the Port Arthur News just in the last couple of months. My interest in the Attakapaw language and culture and my broader interest in Southeast Texas history threatened my prospects for ever finishing my dissertation at SMU on British religious history in the 18th century. But I did finish it, just to put it on record, and I have spent a career of 40 years at academic institutions teaching and researching and writing about Christian history, specifically Methodist history, from the 18th century to the present. But as I am retiring, as I'm transitioning into retirement, I've returned to my interest in Southeast Texas and to Attakapaw studies in particular. In 1996, I was delighted to hear about a reunion of Attakapaw descendants in Louisiana and Southeast Texas. Okay, can't hear back here. Bill, is this, I notice there is a microphone system here, but it's turned off. Maybe we can get that on, but we're going to need another cord, I think, an extension cord, because I've plugged my computer in there. It'll probably work long enough. Let's see if it does. Let's see if we can get that working. Okay, and we even get light up here. Testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Is that something helping? Not helping at all. Okay, let's see what we got. Volume. That sounds a little more promising. Okay, I'm going to turn this a little bit. I'm going to turn that, that just died. I'm going to turn it right like that. Can you hear any better now? Okay. All right, so I am transitioning into retirement, and I'm going back to my interest in these topics. I was very happy to hear about an organization formed to seek recognition for them in the 1990s. That work is going on. As a matter of fact, I was very happy to hear this evening that there is going to be a representation of Attakapaw people at one of the meetings of the Big Thicket Association. Have we got a feedback loop going on there? That's a problem. How are we doing now? Okay? All right. So, well, there went that. So let me see if I can put stuff together here. Professors have to be able to do this. I'm wearing my blazer and so forth. This is the official male faculty uniform. If the SMU faculty police ask you, I did wear it, even though I might take this jacket off in a little bit. In the last 3 years, I worked with a leading scholar of Native American languages, Dr. Jeffrey Kimball, who in 2022 published through the University of Nebraska Press a definitive reference grammar for the Attakapaw-Ishak language. Dr. Kimball and I then collaborated together writing an article that we called 10 Speakers for the Dead. Hidden Native Identities of Speakers of the Attakapaw Yukhiti Language in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, 1885-1908. That has been accepted for publication in the journal Louisiana History and will be published supposedly in January. One of my roles in that research was to document Attakapaw people who were descendants of the 10 speakers of the language. Now, I have to tell you that Attakapaw people today are not very happy to use the word Attakapaw by itself, and there's a good reason for that. It was an insulting term. In fact, I'm fairly sure, and Jeffrey is fairly sure, it was intended to be insulting. It means people eaters or cannibals. That's exactly what Attakapaw means. But it is not a word in their own language. This is not something they chose to call themselves. It was derived from a Choctaw dialect that was used as a trade language along the Gulf Coast. The word and name Ishak, people, by contrast, was from their own language. So I'm going to speak of them in what follows, as they often do today, with the combined name Attakapaw Ishak. Ishak means people. Attakapaw is that Mobilian Choctaw name that was foisted on them. That's not the first time in history that's happened. Methodists didn't want to be called Methodists. That was a deprecatory term, and John Wesley never would call them that. He always said the people called Methodists, not the Methodists, but the people called Methodists. And the Attakapaw are willing to say, yes, we are those people that were called by that name, but they're not happy about it unless you say Attakapaw Ishak. And if you look on their website today, you'll see it's the Attakapaw Ishak people of southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas. Now, I want to address that matter of cannibalism just one step further. I don't know if some of you have seen this month's Texas Monthly, but the lead story by Stephen Harrigan, front cover story, is about the Karankawa people about whom the same accusation was made. I am not an expert in archaeology, and we have some archaeologists with us, so in great trepidation, I'm going to say one thing about this based on the studies of Lawrence Ayton and others who followed his studies. There have been hundreds and hundreds of studies of native peoples of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana with detailed scientific analyses of what they were eating, and we know what they were eating. The archaeologists go through people's garbage, and they like to say garbage doesn't lie. What they were eating was clams and fish and alligator, bison and bear and deer, beans and corn and squash. There is not a hint of evidence in all of those studies that they were eating human flesh. In fact, some native people recorded by Cabeza de Vaca in the 1500s were horrified when they heard starving Spanish sailors discussing eating the flesh of fellow sailors who had died along the coast. Now, what may be the root of that rumor is that some native people, including Karankawa as well as Attakapaw, may have practiced a ritual eating where they took a tiny piece of the heart of a defeated warrior, a defeated foe, and got younger women of childbearing age to eat that simple piece of the heart as a way. It's interesting to me, it's not a way of putting down their enemies, it's a way of saying your children will inherit the values and the strength of the one that was defeated here. But that's all that we could come up with in terms of what cannibalism might have meant. And as I say, I think that word Attakapaw was a deprecatory term, and we need to clear up that very serious misperception. My question then is this. It has to do with a very particular question about this area right around here. What happened to the native people, the Native Americans of southeast Texas? Now, I will tell you, it's a complicated story. That's one of the reasons why I've prepared an outline for you, kind of like pastors who prepare sermon outlines, in the hope that some of the board people will at least look at the outline instead of listening to the sermon or whatever. But you've got an outline there, and we are making more copies of these. Dale back there has got some more copies. If you'll hold up your hand, she'll try to get a praise the Lord. Hands are coming up all over this auditorium. Okay, so Dale, we need lots of copies up here. You got the outline. I've given you some charts of nomenclature regarding these native people that explain a little more what their own words were. I've given you an Attakapaw text, a translation of one of the Attakapaw stories. And that text is, I think, very revealing about the Attakapaw people in Lake Charles. Dale, we've got two more who need at least 3, 4. We need 5 more copies if we can. We're working on that. Okay, here we go. Dale is coming. That story is available to you, and then there is a select bibliography, and that bibliography, 2 pages, gives you some of the sources that I've used for this research, but only some of those. Here's the critical problem I want to address. Some of you may have heard the local historian W.T. Block. He was from Port Neches. He wrote about the history of Jefferson County. His son, I believe, gave a talk here at the library in the last year or two. His History of Jefferson County, published in 1976, asked the question why the earliest American settlers to Jefferson County did not report seeing or interacting with native peoples as they did report in most other places in Texas, especially eastern places in Texas. So this really is a question about this area here, this part of downtown Beaumont in the years between 1821 and 1836. And I'm going to use Noah and Nancy Tevis just as the illustration. We think Noah and Nancy Tevis came to the bluff down there where the courthouse is about 1824, 1826, something like that. Why didn't they report seeing native people? Well, W.T. Block had searched very extensively through source material to find references to native people in the accounts of the earliest Jefferson County settlers. And he concluded that he simply couldn't find evidence of that. Block, other historians following W.T. Block have either accepted his conclusion that the native Attakapaw Ishak had left southeast Texas by that time, or they simply profess the mystery. Similarly, there's a historical marker in Orange, right downtown by the waterfront, that states that the Attakapaw natives of Orange County, and I quote, disappeared from Texas in the early 19th century, either becoming extinct or integrating into other tribes, end of quotation. But a history of Orange County published in 1986, an article jointly authored by a woman from Orange County and Dr. Russell Long, who had been at Lamar University. Some of you may know about Dr. Long's work in archaeology and other fields. But that article simply says, quote, no one knows for sure what became of the Attakapaw in Orange County. I myself have checked W.T. Block's sources, and I spent a day here in the library a year ago examining the business ledgers of early settler and trader John J. French, but I found no clear records of transactions with native people, as I expected to find. W.T. Block may have missed one reference to native people in a long letter from Connecticut native Joseph Pulsifer, dated 21st of May, 1836. Now, this is a very long letter. He hasn't written to his sister back in Connecticut because what's happening is the end of the Texas Revolution and the runaway scrape and San Jacinto, and he's writing to tell her everything. And the letter, interestingly, is dated from Beaumont, comma, formerly Santa Ana. That was the Mexican name for the community closer to the port area here. No, closer to the chemical plant down that way where some of the early settlers had come. Pulsifer wrote in that letter, quote, "I was selling off very fast and made quite a profitable trade with about a dozen Indians." Pulsifer didn't specify who these natives were. They could have been local Attakapaw Ishak people or other groups like Alabama and Coshada who were passing through the area. The same letter gave his eyewitness account of the runaway scrape in this area and noted the fear of settlers when they encountered Native Americans fleeing along with them. These were likely people of the Alabama tribe who had settled north of the Texas coast and were fleeing along with Texian settlers, while their Coshada counterparts had decided to stay and side with the Texian cause. The settlers, according to Pulsifer, were reassured when an interpreter explained that the native people were fleeing Santa Anna's army along with the rest of them. But the settlers' consternation at seeing Native American people suggests that they were not at all accustomed to encountering them. So the question remains, what happened to the native people? What I'm going to offer here is a geographically broad and a chronologically long perspective in which I will suggest some reasons why the earliest American settlers in southeast Texas found so few, if any at all, native people when they arrived beginning around 1824, and what had likely happened to them. So first, I'm going to go to there's my question reiterated there. I'm going to offer a broad geographical perspective. In order to understand who the native peoples of southeast Texas were, I think it's important to recognize in the first place the very large variety of native peoples identified historically as Attakapaw in Louisiana as well as Texas. Although there had been sporadic earlier contacts with European people, for example, Cabeza de Vaca in 1528, European people had sustained contact with Attakapaw Ishak from 1703 when explorers commissioned by the French governor of Louisiana, Bienville, moved west along the coast from New Orleans. They found the Attakapaw Ishak on the banks of rivers and bayous and on the coastal prairies of southwestern Louisiana from Bayou Teche to the west. But only 3 or 4 rivers seem to have had long-lasting settlements. Historic evidence, including the language evidence from we have extensive language knowledge from the Attakapaw people of Lake Charles, and it points to 3 major groups within the broader Attakapawan family of native peoples. In the first place was an eastern group. They called them in Attakapaw Hiekiti Ishak. Ishak means people. Hiekiti means sunrise or eastern people. The area on Bayou Teche, which they left moving westward in the early 1700s, on the Vermilion and Mermentau rivers, and on Bayou Nez Peak, where the Hiekiti Ishak flourished, had been settled by European peoples beginning in the mid-1700s, who named it the Attakapaw Territory. Now, it's spelled like it's spelled in French. You'll see this in the nomenclature charts, Attakapas, Attakapaw Territory for the native people of the area. St. Martinville on Bayou Teche became the center of one of the first parishes established after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a parish called Posta des Attakapaw, the Attakapaw Post. It's believed that the Opelousas people were Hiekiti Ishak or closely related to them. But by the time the Yukiti Ishak language was recorded in the late 1800s, the Hiekiti Ishak seemed to have been declining in the face of incoming European, then American people. If you go to St. Martinville, you'll see not only the Evangeline Oak and all of that sort of story, but there is a statue of an Attakapaw warrior on the main square in the town there, and also a building that they called the Attakapaw College, but it was not referring to native people there. It just meant the local high school or training center for people in that area. The next group I want to mention are called Yukhiti Ishak. The Yukhiti Ishak on the Calcasieu River area and into southeast Texas, that's why this is important, were described as Western in relation to Hiakiti. So they're Eastern and Western, but just to confuse you a little more, I'm going to call them Central within a whole range of Attakapawan groups, including a group that was west of here at the mouth of the Trinity River. Yukhiti Ishak included not only communities on the Calcasieu River, but also extending through the wide area of southwestern Louisiana that once formed a single huge parish that they called Imperial Calcasieu, comprising 4 current-day Louisiana parishes. But the Yukhiti Ishak also extended into the lower Sabine and Neches River valleys in Texas, and I believe that the long-standing settlement on the Neches River at what is now Port Neches, Grigsby's Bluff, was also a substantial outlying community related to the Yukhiti Ishak. And then the third group is a group that I'm going to call Orcoke Ishak. They have been called by the very truncated name Akokisa in a lot of the scholarly literature, but there's a reason for calling them Orcoke Ishak on the Trinity River and San Jacinto River valleys. Their language and culture seems to have been sufficiently distant from either of the previous 2 groups to distinguish them as a separate language, though recent language studies have demonstrated, and this is Jeffrey Kimball's 2022 book on the Attakapaw language, he has demonstrated that the 45 known words from the Orcoke Ishak people were not only close to Attakapaw Ishak words, at least 44 of them are, but they show consistent forms of mutation of word changes, pronunciation changes from the Attakapaw to the Orcoke Ishak people, demonstrating that the Orcoke Ishak were closely related to the other Ishak groups. In fact, the word Ishak in the name of the Orcoke Ishak people means people, just like Ishak in the Attakapaw language. You can see just the slight variation in the pronunciation of the word there. So that these 3 groups constituted a very broad family of Attakapawan, you notice I'm using that as an adjective there, Attakapawan people that stretched all the way from the Atchafalaya Swamp east of St. Martinville through the Lake Charles area and the coastal prairies of southwestern Louisiana, through this area, southeast Texas, through the lower Trinity River Valley, and all the way into present-day Houston area, a region that covered 250 miles east to west. Previous studies have only recognized Attakapawan peoples in some of these areas, and in some cases did not recognize the breadth of Attakapawan areas, very often because, surprise, surprise, they focused on only one of these groups, or because their studies were limited either to Texas or to Louisiana. So Lawrence Ayton, whom I have to regard as one of the foundational archaeologists for this area, but his book is about the coastal peoples of Texas, and he doesn't extend his study of Attakapaw into Louisiana. So you get some disjointed stuff because of the way that we divide up states and areas now, but the Attakapaw people didn't feel that they were crossing an international or a state border when they crossed the Sabine River. So this is the way I chart these out. On the far west, the Orcoke Ishak, at roughly what's Wallaceville, Texas, really just when you cross the I-10 bridge coming this way from Houston, there is a little post office. That's pretty much all there is of Wallaceville. But just north of the I-10 corridor, there was a Spanish mission, a Spanish fort, a presidio, and that's where the Orcoquissac people had lived. In the central area around the village that the native people called Tolnung, it's just south of Lake Charles on Prian Lake. It's exactly where the Lake Charles Country Club is today. They picked good land, and that was the center of the Yuquiti-Ishak, and then further over were the Hiekiti-Ishak in the east, and they, as I say, had been declining probably through the 1700s and weren't as strong by the 1800s. Just for fun, here is Bernardo de Miranda y Flores' map of the Texas coast, 1757. Now, this is pretty weird stuff, and it's a pretty terrible map, so I'd encourage you to stay with Google Maps or something like that. But if you see, this is supposed to be, the dark is water, okay? So this is supposed to be Sabine Lake. It shows the Rio de Neches right there. That's the Neches River, but something is missing. He doesn't even show the Sabine River on this map. That's a problem. But you will see on either side of Sabine Lake, at that point he shows Attakapaw communities. Now that's 1757, and as a matter of fact, an article just came out in the Gulf Coast Historical and Biographical Review showing that this map, 1757, was one of the very first, if not the very first, that used the teepee as a symbol for a Native American village. Now that's weird here because the natives in this area didn't use teepees. It's more plains tribes that had that kind of housing. But here you see Galveston Bay. Here is a little, it says Laguna in there. Here is Orcoquissa. Here is Atascoso, but that's Atascocita. That's going to become the Mexican administrative center of Atascocito. This is the Trinity River. Here is the San Jacinto River, which ought to go into Galveston Bay, but they've got it going out to the coast. Like I say, don't follow this map, it's going to mess you up. But it shows some further Orcoquissa people even west of there. So I think that if you include Orcoquissa people in the whole range of people along the coast, it's going to be 300 miles probably along the coast that you've got these very, very large groups. So the distinctions made within the Attakapaw language between Yuquiti-Ishak and Hiekiti-Ishak and further recognition of the Orcoquissac in Texas allow us to understand the natives here on the lower Sabine and Neches rivers not as generically Attakapaw-Ishak people, but as particular bands related to the Yuquiti-Ishak of Lake Charles. Now, I hate to say it like this. I know in Texas people like to say everything in Louisiana is derivative and the other way around, but it really does look like the major community of this central group of Attakapaw people was in the Lake Charles area, and the natives over here were kind of outlying communities. Now, hold that idea in mind because I'm going to say a few more things that will bring us back around to the question of what happened to the native peoples, why the settlers didn't find them. I now turn to a long chronological perspective that's going to reveal two elements of the context for this question that I'm asking. The first has to do with the decline of native peoples and then shifting alliances between coastal native peoples in the period leading up to 1821 when U.S. settlers began to come into this part of Texas. On the decline of native people, the best studies that we've got are either, those of Lawrence Ayton that I mentioned here, and a number of other studies, especially around Galveston Bay. Just tens and tens and tens, if not 100 or so, studies of shell middens, especially in the Galveston Bay area. And he tried to put all of this evidence together and estimate numbers of native peoples of southeast Texas and elsewhere on the Texas coast. and to show that they had declined significantly after the beginning of European presence from the 1770s. Ayton showed that the numbers of native peoples of the Texas coastal region, including Attakapaw-Ishak, but also Orcoquissac and Karankawa and other groups further south on the coast, all declined significantly from the 1770s forward, a loss of population so significant that it led him and others to presume the demise or extinction, as he said, of entire tribal groups. Ayton could even speak of the total extinction of some of these groups, though he used the word extinct in a very specific sense, meaning that they no longer lived in communities together. Hold that in mind, because extinction is one of the deeply problematic words that we've got to deal with here. This pattern of population decline cannot be interpreted apart from historical realities. The period of decline from the 1700s through the early 1800s corresponds to the opening of Texas to Spanish exploration and settlement, the opening of Louisiana to French settlement from 1703, as well as Spanish settlement after 1763, and the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. The further opening of Louisiana Purchase territories, including present-day Louisiana, to U.S. settlement after 1803, followed 18 years later, 1821, by the opening of impresario colonies in Mexico to people from the United States, all concurred with renewed outbreaks of disease and hostilities from U.S. settlers in the early 1800s. Large-scale declines in the populations of Texas coastal tribes, including Attakapaw-Ishak in the 1700s, were tied to outbreaks of diseases, and smallpox was indeed the leading killer. I was told that they all got smallpox and they all died off. Well, a lot of them got smallpox, but they didn't all die off, is what I really want to say. Ayton's evidence, though, shows that specific outbreaks of smallpox among coastal peoples occurred simultaneously with outbreaks on the east coast of the United States, and in some periods simultaneously with outbreaks in Mexico. That shows how closely the coastal people of Texas were in fact linked to the wider world in the 1700s and the 1800s. In the long chronological perspective, the depopulation of native peoples of Texas and Louisiana coasts weighs heavily in the background of this question about what happened to native people in southeast Texas. But I also want to note some changing relationships between the Spanish, the Orcoquissac, and the Attakapaw-Ishak, who were very close to this area. There are indications that the Yuciti-Ishak and Orcoquissac alliances with the French against the Spanish in the mid-1700s, even though the Orcoquissac were in Texas under Spanish rule and the Louisiana Attakapaw-Ishak were supposedly under French rule until 1763. These relationships make it clearer that the Yucati-Ishak of Louisiana and Texas remained distinct despite alliances between them. Spanish leaders had suspected and feared French incursions into Texas from the early 1700s, and from the 1840s they established a presidio, San Agustin de Ahumada, and a mission, Nuestra Señora de la Luz, Our Lady of the Light, on the site of the Orcoquissac village near the mouth of the Trinity River. And by the way, if you haven't seen it, there is a historical marker about, we don't have many 18th century historical markers in Texas, but there, except San Antonio, right? But there is one at Wallaceville that celebrates that presidio and mission, and the priests who died there actually are honored by that. When Spanish authorities captured French trader Joseph Blancpain near Orcoquissac in 1755 and held him as a prisoner for trading with the Orcoquissac, a group of Attakapaw-Ishak from the east, and maybe from right around here, threatened to attack the Spanish to defend the Orcoquissac, whom they regarded as their kindred. In 1764, following the conclusion of the 7 Years' War and the French concession of Louisiana territories to Spain, The Spanish viceroy appointed a new commander, Captain Rafael Martinez Pacheco, to renew the life of the earlier Orcoq-Isaac Presidio and mission near Wallaceville. Pacheco invited not only Orcoq-Isaac people, but also Yucquiti-Ixoc, including the Ixoc people from southeast Texas, to that Spanish Presidio and mission. But his sense of the similarities between these Atacapawan groups seems to have been mistaken. After being welcomed to the mission and Presidio, they had a big party to welcome the Atacapaw people, and they even told them that they could bring a French flag even though they weren't supposed to be carrying it anymore, and the ones in Texas weren't supposed to have the French flag anyway. But they made a concession. You can bring the French flag with you as they rode I-10, say, from here to Wallaceville, and but they had to deposit the French flag in the guardhouse once they got to Orcoq-Isaac village. They had a big party to celebrate, and then after the party, the Atacapaw Ixoc people responded that, quote, they were ready to gather with all their nation in a mission, but that the Atacapaw mission should be separate from their kinsmen, the Orcoq-Isaac. This shows, on the one hand, that the Atacapaw Ixoc easily recognized Orcoq-Isaac as their kinsmen, but on the other hand, they hesitated to be grouped together immediately with them. But an evidence of growing solidarity between these groups in Texas came a decade later when a Spanish Franciscan, Juan Agustin Morfi, traveled through Spanish America, including Texas, and wrote down a series of lengthy notes on the history of Texas. Morfi's notes exclude an explicit description of the close connection between the Atacapaw Ixoc and the Orcoq-Isaac people in Texas in his time. And this is a quotation from Father Morfi. He says, though the Atacapaw should be considered as under the jurisdiction of Louisiana, and he meant under the Spanish jurisdiction of Louisiana at that time, they are frequently included with the peoples of the province of Texas because of the ease with which they change their domicile. I want to flag that, the ease with which they change their domicile, their place of residence, and because they live more in Texas since they joined the Orcoq-Isaac, with whom they have practically become one nation. I think this makes it clear that some of the Orcoq-Isaac and Atacapaw Ixoc had grown closer together in the later years of the 18th century. So given what I've proposed about the center of Yucquiti-Ixoc in Calcasieu Parish, the people named as Atacapaw on the Sabine and Neches rivers in Texas would have been outlying communities in relation to the larger community of Yucquiti-Ixoc in Lake Charles. So the Native Americans of southeast Texas had been declining since the 1770s along with other groups, and this bears on the question of what happened to them around 1824 when U.S. settlers began to arrive. So once again, here we are back to it. What happened to the Native American people of southeast Texas? With all these contexts, geography, chronology in mind, I return now to W.T. Block's question about what happened to the native people in the specific period just ahead of the opening of Texas to American settlers and the period right after that. I'm going to focus on three historical accounts here that I think have not been widely recognized. First, in 1817, the account of Warren D.C. Hall. He was a colonel from the United States who had participated in several of the filibustering expeditions to Texas that advocated freedom from Spanish rule. On one occasion in 1817, Hall traveled overland from Bolivar Peninsula to Lake Charles. Get this in your mind now. How would you get from Bolivar to Lake Charles without a clear trail, without I-10, actually, okay, right? And without Google Maps? The account of his travels given by Galveston physician Dr. J.O. Dyer does not mention any native peoples at all between Bolivar and Lake Charles. Okay, I flagged that. Secondly, 1819, the account of Colonel William Montrose Graham. Colonel Graham followed much the same route in 1819, and his account did not mention any native groups until he arrived at the Attakapaw village in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. Both of these accounts suggest that the wide area between Bolivar and Lake Charles were little populated, if populated at all, between 1817 and 1819. However, hold on right there, because the account of Juan Antonio Padilla is very different. And Bloch knew about this, but I don't think he got some of the implications of what Padilla says. A more detailed report written in 1819 suggests a relatively large continuing community of native people on the lower Neches. Spanish official Juan Antonio Padilla wrote and this is a quote of his title, Report on the Barbarous Indians of the Province of Texas, end quote, in 1819, same year as Graham's journey through the area, but likely describing the area a few years before, so perhaps around 1815 to 1817. His report does not mention the name Attakapaw, but where we would expect to find it, Padilla's report referred to a group he described as Nacazil. This deserves extended consideration, folks, because I think it's the last clear reference to native peoples in southeast Texas before the arrival of U.S. settlers. First place, the name Nacazil does not seem to be an Attakapaw word, and in fact, the name beginning with N-A is typical of Caddoan place names like Nacogdoches or Natchitoches or Nadaco, which has become Anadarko. But despite the Caddo name, most scholars, including Bloch, believe that Padilla's Nacazil people were in fact the local Attakapaw community, and most likely the community on the lower Neches where Port Neches is today. It was common to use tribal names derived from trade languages like Choctaw or Caddo. The fact that Padilla did not use the Choctaw-derived name Attakapaw and gave the Caddoan-sounding name Nacazil suggests he was using a Caddo, Texas-based source rather than a Choctaw, which would have been a Mississippi or Louisiana-based source for his information. The fact that he mentioned the Nacazil immediately after the Orco-Gisac people, which he talked about, and his description of the two groups are very similar, again points to the cultural affinity of those groups. That's the first thing I note, is just the interesting name Nacazil. Secondly, I note, with great interest, Padilla's reference to the natives of the lower Neches River traveling to Atascocito to the west and Opelousas and Carcachou to the east. Think about that now. That comment places his Nacazil people in direct contact not only with the Mexican Administrative Center at Atascocito. Padilla's comment also indicates contact with the Yuquiti-Ixoc of Louisiana. Carcachou refers to the Calcasieu River, which itself was named for Yuquiti-Ixoc chief Catcaxyoc, which means singing eagle man in the Attakapaw language. Opelousas was closer related to the eastern Attakapaw, Yuquiti-Ixoc, and it was a destination for Spanish cattle brought from Texas by way of Opelousas and Bayou Teche, shipped down the Teche into the lower Atchafalaya River, and then via the Gulf of Mexico at this point on to New Orleans, the route that would eventually be called the Opelousas Trail, which you may know passed through Beaumont, either here or at Collier's Ferry, or possibly even as far north as Deweyville, and that crossing of the that would be a crossing of the Sabine River up there. Third thing I want to note, Padilla estimated that the population of this group, about 200 people, is high, especially compared to what Hall and Graham had mentioned, who they didn't mention native people at all. I believe that Padilla's Nacazil people were in fact the Attakapaw-Ixoc of the area, known to Padilla by a Caddoan name and living around present-day Port Neches, where American settlers reported the existence of at least 6 burial mounds of native peoples. I would surmise that Hall and Graham had crossed the Neches in their routes from Bolivar to Louisiana to the north of there, that is to say where Tevis Ferry, right around here, or Collier's Ferry north of here were to be located, and they may have completely missed the native peoples further downstream on the lower Neches, quote, near the lagoons where it empties into the sea, as Padilla described the location of his Nacazil people. So one further aspect of this. Okay, sorry, there's Juan Antonio Padilla, and I didn't get you forward to the quotation there, but I read it out loud to you. Padilla's description of native people living along the lower Neches just a few years prior to his 1819 report raises again this question: where were they 5 or 6 years later, when settlers from the United States began entering Mexican Texas, and with the possible exception of Joseph Pulsifer's account, did not describe encounters with native people? Bloch surmised that there must have been a large-scale and very rapid catastrophe, perhaps a hurricane, he thought, that afflicted the native people, so that between 1817 and 1824, the population of around 200 people reported by Padilla had been reduced to almost nothing. I think there's a sense in which Bloch may have been right about that, but I got an angle on it that's a little different than the way he thought about it. There were, in fact, 2 or 3 catastrophes in these years. First, a hurricane in 1818 recorded by the Lafitte commune on Galveston Island wiped out the flimsy structures on the island that were part of that commune. Second, as many of you know from Texas history, the winter of 1820 to 1821 was unusually harsh. Quote, so severe that Galveston Bay froze over, end of quotation, if you can imagine that. According to J.O. Dyer's sources, this was the winter that Jane Long spent on the Bolivar Peninsula, and she was, in fact, one of Dyer's sources. Had the remaining Attakapaw Ishak of southeast Texas all died off as a result of those catastrophes? I don't think so. Given Morphy's reference in 1781 to the ease with which the Yuquiti Ishak changed their domicile, and Padilla's claim in 1819 that the natives of the lower Neches had regularly traveled to Atascocito to the west, got to get my directions correct, and Calcasieu to the east, I believe it makes much more sense to think that in the wake of a tragic storm, a brutal winter season, native people would have found their way east to Calcasieu, where their kindred Yuquiti Ishak lived in larger communities. Perhaps some of them found their way west to Atascocito in the Orcoke Ishak lands. The Native American settlement at present-day Port Neches was about 58 miles from Lake Charles to the east and 55 miles from Atascocito to the west, so it's almost equidistant in between those two locations. We could say, moreover, that a third catastrophe for the native people was the arrival of American settlers to this area. And although that began around 1824 or so with Nancy and Noah Tevis and others, native people were very much aware of what was happening in the world around them. They knew from 1821 that Mexican Texas, they called it Sayonne in the Attakapaw language, that means Mexican land, was opening up to a new wave of settlers from the United States. Over a period of 8 or 10 years in the wake of ongoing depopulation, the advent of U.S. settlers, the hurricane of 1818, the cruel winter of 1820 to 21, I surmise, this is my best guess at what happened, that the native people dispersed either to the Yuquiti Ishak community in Calcasieu Parish or to the Orcoke Ishak community in their west at the mouth of the Trinity. That would have left southeast Texas at least temporarily, and I want to emphasize that, at least temporarily, without many of its Native American people at the moment when U.S. settlers began to arrive. However, I still think they may have just laid low, for heaven's sake. What would you do? Kind of like hobbits, you know, when big blundering people come along and they just kind of disappear. But even if native peoples had been forced east to Louisiana and west to Atascocito, it has been long acknowledged that there were Attakapaw Ishak survivors and even speakers of the language in southeast Texas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of them must have returned to Texas or just laid low, as I say. Galveston author J.O. Dyer ended his description of the Lake Charles Calcasieu Attakapaw with the cryptic claim that, and I quote, "Late last century," he meant late in the 1800s, "at Beaumont and Orange, descendants of the Attakapaw clan had their residence." Contemporary scholars Fred Niffen, Hiram Gregory, and George Stokes noted in their book on the historic Indian tribes of Louisiana, 1987, the presence of Attakapaw speakers in Vidor and in Beaumont as well. This does not have to mean that they were Yuciti Ishak who had lived continuously in Texas. They could have been Yuciti Ishak people from Louisiana who later migrated from Louisiana to Texas to pursue work in the lumber industry. That was the case with J.R. Williams, Delphine's husband, or eventually in the petroleum industries. But then again, some of those could have had grandparents or great-grandparents from the Texas Ishak bands who had returned to Calcasieu in the early 1800s. They had been known for, quoting Father Morphy, the ease with which they changed their domicile. Then I want to say something else about the survival of native people that's not widely recognized in our historiography. Significant fact is that the Attakapaw Ishak of Louisiana and Texas never lived on reservations. That has implications for understanding what happened to them beyond the period of Nancy and Noah Tevis and other early U.S. settlers. A standard narrative imprinted on our brains is that native peoples were forced into reservations where they continued to live together in their own communities. Well, that happened to some, but not to all native communities. Consider the very different situation of native people like the Attakapaw Ishak of southeast Texas, who were not and were never on reservations. The 1860 census of the United States was the first to allow census takers to identify and enumerate native peoples living outside of reservations. Instructions for the 1860 census stated, "The families of Indians who have renounced tribal rule and who under state or territory laws exercise the right of citizens are to be enumerated," and that means and they were also to be taxed like everyone else. This was a federal rule, though decisions to create Indian reservations or not had been left to the states. The Yuciti Ishak of the Calcasieu area in 1860 did not need to renounce tribal rule because the last head of their tribe, the last head chief, Chief Lowe, had died around 1850, and after that time, the tribe no longer had a centralized way of making decisions. Some tribal members continued to live in the native village they called Tolnung at the southeastern shore of Prion Lake, though many who lived in Tolnung were also working by day in the wider Lake Charles area. They were already integrating into the broader society there. The Attakapaw Ishak, who married non-native people, had to live with the prejudices of the wider society, not just against Native American people, but against mixed-race people and other ethnic groups as well. I've documented that just one Ishak woman, Delia Moss, was shown as Indian in the 1870 census, mulatto, that means mixed race, in the 1880 census, black in the 1900 census, and then mulatto again in the 1910 census. And by the way, people weren't asked for their racial identifications. They were simply assigned by the enumerators, by the census takers. The death certificate of Delphine Williams, filled out by family members in Port Arthur in 1930, showed her as white, even though she was a speaker of the Attakapaw Ishak language. The Attakapaw Ishak of Texas and Louisiana, like the descendants of other Native Americans not confined to reservations, were free to move as they chose, and they did, looking for job opportunities like Delphine Williams and her husband J.R. Williams, who found work in Beaumont in the lumber industry, and then in Port Arthur, where Delphine herself ran a couple of boarding houses. Native people not confined to reservations married sometimes within their tribal group, but many times outside of it. And so, just to say briefly, though, I've worked with Attakapaw Ishak genealogies, and I can tell you that it's a very complicated thing, but they basically go where they want. They marry who they want. They marry black people. They marry white people. They marry Acadians and so forth. That's the reality of it, and I think more likely to be found in black communities than elsewhere. Certainly that was the case in Calcasieu Parish because that was where they had integrated together. So I'm going to move to my concluding section. What happened to the Native Americans of Southeast Texas? In a long and broad perspective, the Attakapaw Ishak of Southeast Texas were an outer band, a spillover into Texas of the Ukiah Ishak of southwestern Louisiana, who in the face of ongoing population decline, the steady influx of American immigrant settlers, and catastrophes like the 1818 hurricane and the harsh winter of 1820 and 21 were likely to have returned at least temporarily either to their Ishak kindred in Louisiana or possibly to their kindred among the Orcoke Ishak people to the west. The historical marker in orange carries a problematic claim. However, before I do that, I want to do one more thing. Where is Linda Duhan Lacour? Linda, would you come and sort of show yourself a little bit? Would you like to meet a descendant of Attakapaw people? Yes. She happens to be the admin here at this library, okay? And when I first called her to talk to Linda, here we are, okay. When I first called her to talk to her, I said, I'm going to talk about Attakapaw, and she said, oh, that's my family. And when I started checking with her and her daughter, Claudia, who has done a lot of research on this, I found they were all connecting with the same groups of Attakapaw people in Calcasieu Parish that I had been studying over there. So, Linda, any other family members here with you now?
No.
Okay, all right, okay. We were hoping that one of her sons might be here with her, but these are real people. You ever feel extinct?
Yes.
Yeah, I do too sometimes, but it's not very nice. Okay, so let me conclude with two concluding pleas. Thank you, Linda. What happened? You've got my basic idea, but the historical marker in orange states that the Attakapaw people of the area, quote, disappeared from Texas in the early 19th century, either becoming extinct or integrating into other tribes. The evidence that I've found calls that claim deeply into question. Some may have married other Native American people. Delphine Williams' husband, J.R. Williams, is believed to have been Choctaw by some of his descendants, but others married white, black, Creole, mixed race, Acadians, and others, a reality that just seemed somehow inconceivable to the composers of that orange historical marker who presumed that Native people only married other Native people. So in conclusion, I have two pleas to make for you. Thank you for your patience. This has gone on longer than we anticipated. But number one, I want to plead that we stop using the devastating language of extinction as a way of accounting for what happened to the native peoples of Southeast Texas. Yes, in more nuanced, highly nuanced uses, extinction might mean ceasing to exist as a distinct community. There's truth in that. But the word extinction, look it up in any dictionary, including the Urban Dictionary, carries the force of a nuclear holocaust. It means, to most people, simply ceased to exist. That is simply not true. It does not square with what we know about Native Americans outside of reservations in general. It does not square with what we know about the Attakapaw Ishak of southwestern Louisiana and southeast Texas in particular. As the genealogies of Louisiana Attakapaw show, the Attakapaw people were fruitful and multiplied, and I, for one, rejoice that despite all the forces working against them, descendants of Native Americans of southeast Texas are present among us, like Linda. I also want to plead, second and concluding thing, is that we find ways to honor the Native Americans of Southeast Texas. We've simply gone far too long with false or misleading stories of cannibalism and extinction. I don't know any way to solve the myriad problems that all of this raises, like governmental recognition of Native identity, how we could ever repair the long string of treaties with Native peoples that were consistently broken by governments. I'm not aware of any place names remaining in Southeast Texas unless you want to include Anahuac, and that is a Native place name, but one from central Mexico and not from around here. But still I ask, how do we appropriately honor the Native people of this area? How do we get them in the 4th grade and 7th grade Texas history curriculum? How do we recognize more Native sites? And there really are Native sites such as mounds in Jefferson and Orange counties. I wish I had solutions. Honor would be hollow without addressing these kinds of pressing issues, but I doubt that we will be able to address the issues without first honoring the Native Americans of Southeast Texas, and I urge you to join me in finding ways to honor them. Thank you very much. That's my presentation. Thank you for your patience with that. Yeah.
Ted, we appreciate the great talk.
Thank
do you
you.
want to
Yeah.
open it up for
Yeah.
questions?
Very happy to. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
North of Baldwin, Louisiana, there's a group of individuals that refer to themselves as Native. They've even got a little museum there. Is that part of the Atokapaw?
Oh, that's interesting. Now you say north of Baldwin, Louisiana.
Yeah, kinda.
I don't know. Would you send me a note about that?
It's been so long since I've been there, but I know
okay.
they have a nice little museum.
Just say exactly what you said there, north of, and I'll look at. Anybody know about that? That's interesting. I wouldn't be surprised. I have a strong feeling that there's a place called Starks, Louisiana. You know where that is? Starks is right across from Deweyville, right? And it's where one of the old routes of the Opelousas Trail used to run. I just have a very strong feeling. It keeps coming up again and again as a place where Native people ended up. But it's not an incorporated place, so it's kind of an interesting, it might be like that. Yes?
I was an anthropology and linguistics major at the University of Michigan.
Okay.
And once for my winter treat here, I went to a program that was sponsored by Houston Museum of Natural Science. However, it was in northern Louisiana,
Okay.
northeastern Louisiana,
Okay.
and this was what they believe was a very large grouping of Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And that they lived in a very huge community. And that you mentioned burial mounds, and they had burial mounds there.
Yeah, that sounds like the Caddo people of northeast Texas and northwest Louisiana.
Okay,
Yeah.
this was up in the northeastern corner.
Yeah. Yeah. That very much sounds like it.
Many of these people might have ended up there because some of the patterns sound a little bit similar. They found a whole bunch of stone implements that were, except for being stone, they looked just like a door key.
Interesting.
And that they think that they were taking plants and dragging them through and making baskets and using them to carry earth.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. Oh, so to make a kind of you carry basket. Yeah, yeah. Makes sense to me.
Patterns sound a little similar. And I wondered-
Yeah.
Yes, there were.
That was a very, very large group.
Any of them might have ended up in that area.
Yeah, it's quite, I mean, groups integrated. Now, if you look at this Texas Monthly article, it refers to my much younger colleague, Timothy Sider. I'm in the process of retiring now. Tim Sider is just this semester beginning teaching his first classes. He graduated in May at SMU with a degree in history, but he's writing a book on Karankawa people, and they cite him several times. And what he's currently writing on is the presence of what he calls composite bands, which I thought was kind of some sort of odd rock group or something. But he means that in the face of American entry into Texas, natives of different tribes would band together just for the sake of protecting themselves. So in the Dallas area, there's an example where there was a battle May 24th, 1841, when a group of Texas militia, Republic of Texas soldiers, attacked a group of Native American. But it has this long list of all the different tribal groups that were there in that group. So those kinds of composite groups, I think we're going to find out that those were very common, and that could be the case, that some of them sort of melded into Choctaw and other groups. Yeah, that makes sense.
Different groups that kind of got together and pooled resources.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
There is near Baldwin, Louisiana. That lady had mentioned Baldwin, and a place north of there. There's a casino called Cypress Bayou Casino near there, because he used the Baldwin exit off of Highway 90 to get to that casino. And I think it's a reservation that is run by the Chitimacha.
Okay. Chitimacha, yes. Uh-huh.
And so that may have been that museum that the lady that mentioned Baldwin.
All right.
That might be near those that tied to the Chitimacha.
Thank you very much. In fact, as soon as he said that, I remembered being in Baldwin, Louisiana 2 years ago, just on a traveling trip, and we were looking around. Yes, okay. The Chitimacha people were at the edge of the Atchafalaya Swamp. If y'all know where that is on I-10, it seems like it's never going to end. It's just, and if you look at it, it's just amazing. Pull over and look at the place, but it's fantastic. But the Chitimacha were there at the edge, and so were the early Attakapaw people, these eastern Hiekiti Attakapaw. So the eastern Attakapaw began moving westward, maybe with the movement of other people, moving from the United States westward and so forth. But even in the 1700s, so we know that in the mid-1700s, the Attakapaw sold some of their land to a family named Fusilier. You ever heard of Fusilier folks in Port Arthur and so forth? It just makes me feel at home. We've got a member of our Sunday school class in Dallas whose her native name was Fusilier. But the Fusilier, who was a French settler, he bought thousands and thousands of acres of Attakapaw land, and then the Attakapaw moved further west at that point. So we can document some of that change. But back to Baldwin, that's in the area that the Attakapaw, the Hiekiti, the eastern Attakapaw would have been in. They're moving west. The Chitimacha kind of filled in behind them in places where they could, and they're still there.
I think that's what I was looking up. I think that's what we saw.
Yeah, I remember going there.
Cypress Bayou Casino is their casino.
Okay. Casinos. Not going to go there. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you one good thing about a casino. I've never been in one. That's against my religion. But if you go to Oklahoma, to where the Choctaw Casino is, it's incredible advertising, at least in the Dallas area. It's an hour north of Dallas. But they have built on the other side of the freeway, thank you very much, the most fantastic Choctaw cultural center, and utilizing funds. So at least they utilize some funds from that to do something to educate people. And I had a friend from England who was visiting last October, and I took him up there, and he was just bowled over by this. It's terrific. You don't even have to stop at the casino to do this. Yes, here.
My question is actually a two-part question. You mentioned some of the schooling in seventh grade, Texas history schooling.
Yes.
And we're actually working through just a small, only like 100 pages in a workbook that we purchased online for
Okay.
Texas homeschool.
Okay.
Homeschooling students, and it does mention the Attakapaw Indians.
Okay.
And one part of my question is, do you really think that the Karankawa really were in this area? And then also for the Attakapaw, how far north in this area do you think maybe they were? Do you think maybe they extended up as far as Hardin County as well?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, do I think that the Karankawa got this far? Only on trading missions, but the Karankawa did trade, and other groups traded up and down the coast. So all of these trails like I-10 and Highway 90 and whatever was before them and the Opelousas Trail, all of those trails had been in use for probably for centuries, and different groups traveled. And you didn't attack each other typically, unless they thought you were trying to hurt them, because they needed. See, what they needed here, maybe more than anything else, was flint. They needed good stones with which they could make weapons and so forth. And that meant that they had to trade. Now, there's one argument against that, which I think is just the coolest argument. I don't know if it's true or not. I just mean it's cool. And that's Lawrence Ayton has in his I just keep pointing to the two archaeologists I know who are in the room here. Lawrence Ayton has an appendix in his book that says he did this elaborate study of gastroliths, which are stones found in alligators' bodies, and raising the possibility that natives of this area could use gastroliths as a way of producing stone tools. And I said to myself, have no idea if that happened, but that's the coolest idea. I mean, really, it's just like creative. You find these, can you do something with that? I don't know. He had evidence, he thought it was true, that they were supplement, but it still would have been a supplement. They still would have had to have traded. So lots of trade going on. Yes?
Hi, I'm Choctaw Indian. What was the relationship between the Attakapaw and the Choctaws?
Okay, that's not an area of I'm glad to have a Choctaw person represented here. That's not an area that I've studied like I've studied these groups. But in this period, in the late 1800s, well, actually through the 1800s, I would say, when Native Americans were so threatened by settlers and diseases and so forth, they did band together, and it's typical that some groups in Louisiana there were a lot of Choctaw people. I can tell you because that article that Jeffrey Kimball and I wrote together documented 4 different pages of the 1870 Calcasieu Parish census, and it showed 4 different Native American settlements in that. It was a pretty huge area at that point, this very, very large Calcasieu Parish, not what it is today, but in that huge area, one of those communities was Choctaw. So some of the Choctaw had moved this far, or at least that far as Calcasieu River in that period. So I think it's entirely possible that they were moving a lot. And that could be where, if Delphine Williams's husband, J.R. Williams, was Mississippi Choctaw as they think, that could well be the way his people came. Yes?
My dad was born in 1936.
Okay.
When he was a little boy, he used to play in sand pits down the road from his house.
Okay.
That's going to be, if you go from the sand pits through the woods to the river, it's probably about half a mile, and this is up just a little bit north of where Collier's Ferry was.
Okay.
And he said there was pottery back in those sand pits, and when you said that the people that were on the river here, maybe they were laying low, maybe they just went up the river.
Yeah.
4 miles
Hello.
or so.
Yeah. No, I used to think that the answer to this question was that they actually just retreated into the piney woods. Mm-hmm. And so that may well be one of the answers. These groups were historically Attakapaw and I think Karankawa. These groups had base communities, but in the warmer seasons, they would send out hunters, to the prairie when the bison came down to the southern prairies. There were periods when they didn't, but when the bisons came down, they would send out groups of hunters to hunt, and they would be out for days and days. And also, in the coastal areas, they would send out groups to collect clams and other stuff that you could bring home, and they had no ice to keep them on, so but nevertheless, I mean, they're fishing. We know that they had fish weirs, so they had you could put reeds together and build a trap for fish. So in some seasons of the years, they were moving around. So as an addition to what I've said about, based on what Jose Antonio Padilla said about them moving to Lake Charles or to Atascocito, which is, Atascocito is in the city limits of Liberty, Texas today, right? So these two areas. In addition to that, it could be that they just went north and went into the woods. And the woods, as I understand it, are all full of stories of Native Americans that came up there and settled. I'd be pretty easy to believe that. I wouldn't write it unless I had some documentation. But by the way, if you know of areas where people, even in the past, found pottery or other relics, let someone know. Let's anthropologists or archaeologists raise your hands here, okay? Stewards, okay, right. Because it could well be that someone from Lamar is going to say, we've got a class of students and they need a place to study, and who knows? They might decide to check that out. Okay, I got two over here. How about there?
Do you mean Atascocita by the Sam Houston Regional Library?
Yes, I do. In fact,
not Liberty proper. That is, you're getting out into the county.
well,
The river X's right into it, like basically into the woods.
it's true, though. When I'm coming down that Farm to Market Road or whatever, that state highway that's Main Street, Liberty, right? And it goes all the way out there.
140, yes, it goes down to Main Street, but it goes into 146.
It's just the thing is, you come to the Liberty city limit 3 miles from Liberty, from the inside. So that's all I mean by that.
Okay.
It's technically within the city limits of Liberty. Yeah, good point. Yes, sir.
I believe Village Creek was named that because they found native villages up there, and that's how it got its name.
I love Gordon Baxter's book called Village Creek. I hated Gordon Baxter when I was growing up here. I thought he was the very epitome of a Texas hick, sort of whatever. And then I got to Duke University. I'm not making this up. My first day there at Duke, they have the university photographer, and he says, "You're from Beaumont, Texas?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Perhaps you've heard of a wonderful writer named Gordon Baxter." I mean, this was the sort of guy who's into saving whales and stuff. I mean, what are you talking about? And he gave me these National Public Radio recordings that Baxter did, and it was just fantastic. Now that is to say I can't answer your question, but track it down. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could be tracked down. How do we know? A gazetteer might be able to say the name was given by Fred such and such, who said that there was a native village on the site. Well, there you could go and check it out. Why not? Yeah.
Name Village Creek that, and I once had a conversation with Geraldine Watson when she was still
Oh yeah.
working with, trying to get the big ticket as part of the federal system, and she also told me that's where that name came from. Village Creek came from that.
Okay, so actually we can document that there is at least a folk tradition that's where the name came from. That's worth documenting, I think. Very often those things tend to be true. Yes, sir.
I just have a comment.
You're the photographer, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Also, I live in South Clark.
Yes, that too.
When I was doing my master's at Lamar, I did a project for Russell Long.
Okay.
It came out as McFadden Beach. He brought me all these artifacts and I photographed them, and those are the plates in the book.
Yes. Well, in fact, that site was pretty much rifled through. I've been there recently. That excuse me, not McFadden Beach. I was thinking of the Indian cemetery at between High Island and Bolivar. What's that little? There's a little place along there, and everybody would it was just part of the thing. What was her name? The Beaumont historian who wrote the first history of Beaumont. Florence Stratton. Florence Stratton. Your office is across the street from her, isn't it? From her house. Florence Stratton wrote one time that people from Beaumont would get on buses on a Saturday or Sunday to go for a picnic at Port Neches, and they would spend time rifling through the Indian mounds. I mean, it sort of breaks your heart to think about it. It's nice that they were interested and all, but we've lost that, So, though I could make a case that there ought to be a historical marker for the Native American site, not just for the settlement, the Grigsby settlement, and so forth. I think that would get closer to documenting because it's pretty consistently documented. Yeah. How we doing?
good.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it.
And thank you.
And I'd like to be in touch with if you have ideas. I've got cards, and you can write me tedc@smu.edu. But I'd like to hear from you. Thank you.